Chapter 5. Danger on Deck. For the next 2 days, Ranger followed Patrick around the ship as it surged through the waves. The men from the shipyard who had come along on the maiden voyage helped with whatever needed to be done, assisting first-class passengers, peeling potatoes, delivering messages. Whenever he had a moment, Patrick went down to the third-class cabins to visit his new friends, Hamad and Miriam. The people from the village welcomed him and Ranger with figs from their trees back home. Most didn't speak English, but those who did told Patrick how they traveled on donkeys to Beirut, sailed from there to Marseille, and then taken a train to Cherbourg to board the big ship. Patrick told them how he had helped build the Titanic back in Belfast piece by piece, from her propeller to the funnels that towered over the deck. "But would you like to know a secret?" Patrick said. "Only 3 of the 4 funnels are connected to the boilers. The 4th is just for show, to make the ship look more powerful." "Isn't the ship powerful enough?" Hamad asked. "She certainly is," Patrick said. "There's talk that we could set a new speed record to New York." At the end of each night, Patrick went back to the crew's sleeping quarters. He kept the pouch with his father's 2 shiny pennies under his pillow. How proud his father would be if he could see Patrick now. "That's my boy," he'd say, "sailing clear across the wide ocean so you can care for your mother when you get home." Ranger curled up at the foot of Patrick's bunk at night and let the hum of the ship lull him to sleep. Even though Ranger didn't usually like boats, this big one was different, strong and steady and not at all tippy. Still, Ranger dreamed of his dog bed in the mudroom. He dreamed of squirrels and bacon and Luke and Sadie, and when he'd get to go home. On Sunday, April 14th, Patrick was called to help serve dinner in the first-class dining room. There were oysters and poached salmon, duckling and lamb and beef. Dessert was a spread of pudding, ice cream, and eclairs. Ranger wasn't allowed in the dining room, so he climbed the stairs to the top of the ship and wandered the boat deck while Patrick was busy with dinner. One of the little yappy dogs always barked at Ranger, but most of the passengers were happy to see him. The lady strolling on deck would pause and bend down to pet his head. "Miriam!" someone shouted just as Ranger was getting his neck scratched by a lady in a fluffy black hat. Ranger turned and saw Hamad hurrying along the deck with a little rag doll. "Miriam!" Hamad called, looking around. When he saw Ranger, he ran to him and dropped to his knees. "I can't find my sister," he said. "Find?" Ranger's ears perked up. He sniffed the little doll in Hamad's hand. It smelled of the third-class cabins, like smoke and spices. But there was another smell, too, the Miriam girl. He wandered off. "Can you help me find her?" the boy asked. "Find?" Ranger knew that command from his search and rescue training. He'd always been able to find Luke in the practice sessions. He'd found him hiding in the woods on hot summer days and buried in the snow on winter mornings. He'd practiced finding Luke in the wide-open meadows and on busy city blocks, but he'd never found anyone on a ship before. Ranger sniffed the air. There were lots of people smells here. First-class men and women were rushing back to their cabins. They smelled of soap and perfume and the greasy meat they'd eaten for supper. Another smell hung over the deck boat, too. Ranger tipped his nose to the dark sky and sniffed the brisk, icy air. He smelled cold and fishy and sharp. It smelled cold and fishy and sharp, but there was no Miriam smell. Ranger led Hamad to the back of the boat, where he looked down to the deck below, where third-class passengers could walk in the open air at the boat's stern. It was late, and the sky was dark. The night air was too cold for stargazing. All the passengers had gone to their cabins. The deck was empty. "She's not there. I'm going to find help," Hamad said as he turned and walked away. Just as Ranger was about to follow him, he caught a scent in the wind, but then it was gone. Ranger walked all along the railing. He kept sniffing the cold air, searching for the Miriam smell. Finally, there! Ranger looked down at the empty deck. There were no people, only a big crane that the crew used to move baggage sometimes. Earlier, some of the boys from third class had been climbing it, shimmying out on the long arm and then dropping down to the deck. They'd raced around, playing and climbing, until their fathers made them stop. But the boys were gone now, and Miriam was nowhere to be found. Every time Ranger caught her scent, it disappeared again. The smell was too scattered for him to follow. Where was she? Ranger sniffed the air and barked. Then he heard a high, scared voice. Help, please! I'm up here! Chapter 6. Climbing High. Ranger looked down. Miriam had climbed out almost to the tip of the crane's arm. She was hugging the metal and looked like she'd been there a while. Her hands were chapped and raw in the cold ocean air. Her face was streaked with tears. I'm stuck, Miriam shouted. She clung to the crane with one arm and tugged at her skirt with the other. The fabric was caught in the machinery. Ranger barked. He couldn't help Miriam. He didn't know how to get down to the deck below. There were no stairs. Even if he jumped, he couldn't climb the big machine and get her down, but he could bring someone who would. Ranger took off running across the deck. He bounded down 3 flights of stairs to the saloon deck where Patrick had been working. The first-class passengers had all gone to bed, but a few stewards remained, cleaning up dessert dishes and straightening chairs. There, Ranger saw Patrick collecting teacups on a big tray. He ran up and barked. Patrick jumped and almost dropped the tray. The cups and saucers rattled and clinked together. What are you doing, dog? Patrick's voice sounded cross. He put the tray down and reached for Ranger's collar. Ranger darted away from him. Patrick followed him. Ranger barked and took a few steps down the hallway. He ran back to Patrick and jumped on him. Then he ran down the hallway again. What is it, dog? Patrick asked. What's wrong? He followed Ranger through the reception area and up the grand staircase. Ranger led Patrick to the back of the ship. This time he caught Miriam's scent in the hallway and followed it up to the deck where he'd seen her earlier. As soon as he stepped out into the cold night air, Ranger heard her crying. He barked and pawed at Patrick's leg. Patrick looked way up at the arm of the crane. Miriam, he shouted. He took off his jacket and threw it on the deck. Then he hoisted himself onto the base of the crane and began to climb out its long arm. Patrick's heart pounded. He'd been terrified of heights ever since his father's fall at the shipyard. He'd always found reasons to work on the lower riveting and painting sites instead, but this was different. Hold on, Miriam, I'm coming, Patrick called. He clung to the cold metal with his knee and reached for the neck support. His hands were already numb from the cold, but he kept climbing. The crane's arm wobbled every time Patrick moved. He forced himself not to look down. He kept his eyes on Miriam until finally he reached her and grabbed her icy hand. My dress, she cried, looking down. Her skirt was caught between 2 pieces of metal, as if the big machine had taken a bite of it to hold her there. Hold on tight again, just for a moment. Patrick let go of Miriam's hand. He wrapped his legs and one arm around the metal support and reached down as far as he could stretch. Finally, he felt the rough fabric in his hand. He gathered a handful and tugged, but the crane held on. Patrick took a deep breath. He held the fabric tight and yanked as hard as he could. Finally, the skirt pulled free. There, Patrick said. Now let's climb down together. He shimmied backward down the crane's arm, stopping every few inches to guide Miriam's boot to the next foothold. When he made it to the base of the crane, he jumped down and reached up with both arms. Miriam leaned into them. He lifted her down onto the deck just as Hamad raced up the stairs with a man from their village. There you are, Hamad said. He looked as if he couldn't decide whether to hug his sister or throw her overboard. What were you doing? Miriam started to cry again. I wanted to climb up like the boys did, she said. I wanted to see onto the other deck. Ranger nuzzled Miriam's hand until she knelt to pet him. That quieted her down. Patrick and Ranger walked Maud and Miriam back to the third-class cabins. It was nearly 11:30, and most of the families had gone to sleep. The music had stopped, and the instruments were all put away. "Thank you," Hamad told Patrick. "Thank him." Patrick nodded down at Ranger and gave him a scratch behind his ear. "He's the one who came to get me." Hamad knelt and gave Ranger a tight hug. Then he stood and said good night to Patrick. "Sleep well." As Patrick and Ranger turned to leave, the floor shuddered beneath their feet. A terrible scraping, crunching noise rattled the air, a grinding, grating sound, like a boat running up on rocks at the beach. Then doors opening and closing, and rushing, thumping footsteps. "What is happening?" Hamad asked Patrick. "Did we bump something?" "I'm not sure," Patrick said, but he had a terrible feeling. He opened the door and looked up and down the hallway. There didn't seem to be any warnings. "I'll go see, but I'm sure it's nothing. Try to get some sleep." There were more footsteps rushing down the hallway above them. Then it was quiet again. Too quiet. The engines had stopped.